and we're all set. Architectural historian and preservationist Kevin Block received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University and his doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley. He has taught courses in architectural history and American studies at Berkeley and most recently at Princeton. His research focuses on the history of American architecture in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially the development of architecture as a profession. This presentation is part of a book-length project about Vincent Kling and the figure of the corporate architect. Kevin writes a newsletter about this project entitled The Architect as Doer. I hope maybe at the end of the talk, he'll give us more information about that. And like some of you, he was born at Lankenau Hospital. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the virtual podium, Kevin Block.
Thank you, David. Also, thank you to Dan Vieira for inviting me tonight. Thank you to everyone for showing up this evening. Very glad to be here. Glad to follow Al's lecture from 2 weeks ago. And I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so I have some preliminary comments that I'll make just to situate everyone within the book project, and then I'll just kind of take off and start running with what is really a chapter on Lankenau. Okay, so here is the lecture outline. I'm going to briefly describe the book project, and then I'll describe Kling's path to Lankenau, speaking about some of the projects that preceded the project that really was the breakthrough for his career, his young career. And finally, I'm going to consider perhaps a surprising aspect, and an aspect that's not always included in architectural history, which is fundraising, and how actually how the hospital itself was critical to fundraising and really symbolized the hospital's place in a community that was undergoing change. So very briefly, this is the most text that will appear on any given slide. The book project is tentatively entitled One Vast Klingdom, Philadelphia's Corporate Architect, 1946-1976. So I'm really focusing on those post-war years where Kling emerged as a really recognizable corporate architect in Philadelphia. If you stopped a random person, not necessarily an architectural cognoscenti on the streets of Philadelphia, and you said, name an architect, chances are that person probably would have said Vincent Kling as much as Lou Kahn, even though now a figure like Lou Kahn or Robert Ventura is much more recognizable. But he was people knew of him, his work was everywhere. He was a really important figure, and yet we don't really talk about him at all today. Almost nothing is written about him, so that interests me. I want to place as I was suggesting, the architecture of genius alongside the architecture of bureaucracy. Those are Henry Russell Hitchcock's terms for corporate architecture, the architecture of bureaucracy, and architecture with a strong A, the architecture of genius, the architecture that the discipline itself takes seriously. I think it's helpful to look at them side by side from a historical perspective and look at the interaction between academic architecture and architecture as an industry in a much wider world. I want to take seriously all of Kling's work, even the schlock, even the clunkers. I am not trying to revive Kling as some heroic figure. I don't necessarily love all of his work. I'm not going to try to convince you to love all of his work, but I want to convince you to take it seriously and to look at the work beyond Center City, beyond just Penn Center. Time is also of the essence for this project. Many of the people who knew Kling and worked with him are now sadly in retirement. They've moved away from the area. Many of them have passed away. I'm trying to speak with them and assemble as much of the archive as I can to get a better sense of Kling and his firm. Some general themes and for this project in general in the history of corporate architecture: authorship, right? Not just individual, but collaborative art authorship, corporate art, authorship, entrepreneurship, diversification. And by that, I mean a firm doing many different kinds of projects, not just specializing in one kind of project. Marketing, professionalism versus avant-gardism, as I've addressed, and the role of corporate architecture as a vernacular, as existing throughout the landscape and almost blending into the background of a new kind of landscape. Okay, so one of my big academic interventions for this project, and I know this is a public-facing lecture, so you don't necessarily need to speak too much to the academic interventions, but I'll just offer them. I'm really interested in the emergence of the corporate architect in relation to place, right? The corporate architect was not just the predecessor of the global architect, which we think of as floating above place, working all over the world, not grounded in one regional economy necessarily. But when you look at Kling's career, it's very clear that he was embedded in a regional economy in Philadelphia, Greater Philadelphia, and in some of the surrounding states. And also, one of the interventions is to show that the figure of the corporate architect emerged from a suburban landscape, not just from an industrial landscape. Okay. So this slide speaks to the relation between a figure like Kling and a better known figure like Kahn. In a July 1970 issue of Philadelphia Magazine, not part of the architectural press, but a popular magazine, there was a twin profile of the architect as doer, that's Vincent Kling. In Philadelphia, the byline reads, "Few people forgive him for his success." And then the architect as dreamer. Can Philadelphia tolerate geniuses like Louis Kahn? No. And there was this fantasy about what would happen when you combined Kling and Kahn. You'd get this monster form, Kling-Kahn, right? And that was a funny joke that people told. And it really just expressed the complementarity of those two kinds of figures in the same moment, in the same place. And this is just some cultural history for you, July 1970, an early computer dating cover when it was all the rage. Okay, so Kling's path to Lankenau. I'm going to bring us along from the perspective of the young architect. What is the path he has to take to get to a project like Lankenau, not having necessarily specialty, but developing it? So we'll start with SOM's Sloan Kettering Institute, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's, probably the quintessential post-war corporate architecture firm. We'll then move to the Institute for Cancer Research at Fox Chase. That's in Northeast Philadelphia. Many of you probably are familiar with it. And then we will go to the Hunterdon County Community Hospital in Northwest New Jersey, what was a rural area of New Jersey, and it was an early Kling project. It was really the one that preceded Lankenau most directly. Okay, so in around 1945, the field of hospital architecture was in the process of despecialization. That's a long term, but it's just meant to describe a process whereby a specialty group of architects known as hospital architects, which really developed the modern hospital as such, were being displaced. and they were being displaced by two different forces. One of the forces was the corporate firm, like most specifically SOM. The second force was the federal government through a piece of legislation called the Hill-Burton Act. So SOM, in very short order, because of the Oak Ridge project in Tennessee, which was a production site for the atomic bomb, expanded from 24 employees in 1942 to 650 employees by the end of 1944. So just astronomical growth. And then when the war winds down, they need to figure out, where are we going next? We've built this huge firm, and we need to figure out the markets where we'll enter to maintain productivity and growth. So one of the sectors that they decide to go into, really under the direction of one of their partners, Robert Cutler, was the hospital field. When the veterans were returning from the war, everyone knew that the babies would be born, the baby boomer generation was coming, and they needed to construct hospitals to keep up with that need. Hospital construction had really lapsed since the Great Depression. There was very little hospital construction in the 30s. There was very little hospital construction during the war. So they had to very rapidly catch up, and firms like SOM got involved. So between 1945 and 1951, SOM completes 22 hospitals at approximately $134 million worth of value. Kling leaves the Navy. He's stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. He joins the SOM office in Newark. He works directly under Cutler and alongside a lead designer named Harry Arons, and he's involved in the hospital projects. So this is where he gets his exposure. On the left here, you'll see the 600-bed New York University Bellevue Medical Center in Manhattan. Huge hospital. It embodies many of the typical features of an SOM hospital. For one thing, they always start with the nursing wing. That's the best view. And it's normally a single loaded corridor. That means that the nursing rooms will be facing, generally speaking, the south, whereas on the north side of the corridor, you'll have nursing stations, storage rooms, but the whole site is designed around the best view in the house. And there's normally a long ribbon window, that classic feature of modern design, with a solar barrier, brise soleil, over it. And then there's a stem coming off of that nursing block that holds many of the diagnostic equipment, many of the laboratories. And in an H-plan hospital, there's a clinical wing. So there can be a T-plan, which is a nursing stack and a stem, an H-plan, which I'll go into. There's also U-stems, but this is the basic SOM hospital that's recognizable. It's normally 2 rooms per bay, very repetitious, but SOM's argument is the structural simplicity of the nursing stack will allow us to spend more of the budget on a luxurious interior. Okay, so that's the first force that's leading to the despecialization of the field. The second force is the federal government. So, as I said, by the Depression and World War II, hospital construction was standing still. Remarkably, 40% of US counties by 1945 still did not have a general hospital. Remarkable, right? So, so when the veterans came back, there was the Veterans Administration system, but also the civilian population needed to be served. And the federal government passed legislation that would provide for 1/3 the cost of all hospital construction. So as you can see in these little infographics, most of this federal funding was meant to even the distribution of hospitals in the United States. Much of Hill-Burton funding went to the South and also parts of the West, right? In the Northeast, they received Hill-Burton funding, but generally speaking, in the centers of the state, away from the major metropolitan areas, but also in some of those areas where there wasn't hospital coverage. Really importantly, the Hill-Burton Act not only supplied funding for construction, but it supplied education. It got a lot of young architects up and running with hospital design through the technical services branch of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which was led by this figure here. I'm circling him with my mouse. His name was Marshall Schaffer. He's really an unsung hero of the period. And what his office, the Technical Services Branch, does is it worked with equipment manufacturers to produce catalogs that would make it easy for young, inexperienced architects to learn about all of the incredible new technology that would be placed into these new facilities. He developed minimum standards, right? He didn't dictate, the office didn't dictate the design of hospitals, but it developed minimum standards that a new generation of architects would use in these projects. They made technical consultants available through the AIA, and they did prototype studies. So in general, this was a bottom-up approach to hospital design. People like Jane Jacobs, the famous urbanist of the Death and Life of Great American Cities, way before she was that famous urbanist, she was covering the Meds and Eds beat for Architectural Forum. She writes a glowing profile of Marshall Schaffer. Why? Because he embodies a bottom-up, anti-dictatorial, anti-Robert Moses style approach to community development. Okay, so we're moving along here to Sloan Kettering. Sloan Kettering is the probably the foremost medical research facility of the period, the mid-40s. As the name implies, Alfred P. Sloan, the CEO of General Motors, head of research at General Motors, Charles Kettering, the basic idea was that amazing faith that we could apply, Americans could apply the strategies of industrial research to medicine and to medical research, and that if you pumped in money and built new facilities, that we could solve problems like cancer. Okay, so Kling is on this project with SOM, and the basic, this is the basic, this is a nice cutaway graphic from Architectural Forum, which covered Sloan Kettering, and it's basically a service stack right in the center of the building and laboratory space wrapped around. I know that this is a very small plan, but what you're really seeing here is a service stack with the stairs, elevators, restrooms, air supply, gas supply, right front and center of the building, which is on East 68th Street and on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And then around it are modular bays, 24-foot bays of laboratory space. It's really Spartan, unplastered cinder block. The floors are precast concrete. And in the corridors of each floor, there are vertical ducts connecting the laboratory space to hot and cold water, distilled water, compressed air, vacuum, gas, electricity, ventilation, waste disposal. The basic idea is this is flexible space and it's modular design. The budget for the Sloan Kettering Institute in 1950 was $1.8 million. That was twice the expenditure on medical research in all of the United States in 1937. So we are in the age of big science. And from this project, here's just a current Google Earth image of it. SOM did both the Sloan Kettering Institute as well as the James Ewing Hospital. This was another SOM hospital, which was right alongside it. This provided the clinics for the medical researchers right next door. So when you combine the large hospital with the medical research facility, you have what they called an integrated hospital center. Okay, so in 1946, Kling leaves SOM. He stayed for a very short order and he moved to Philadelphia, apparently without a project, but through a beach house that he had done earlier as an undergraduate at Columbia University for a man named Amos Peasley, who sits on the board for the Lankenau Institute for Medical Research. He gets a commission to design a new facility that would in Northeast Philadelphia. So this, to your left, you're seeing the Lankenau Institute for Medical Research. That's on Corinthian Avenue, right by the site for the old German hospital, which is itself right across the street from Girard College. So it's in the city. It's admittedly a bad photograph, but it's a brick building that didn't really accommodate the age of big science. All of, for example, the instrumentation would need to be recalibrated every time a truck drove down Corinthian Avenue, and it couldn't hold all of the animal colony, the lab rats and the mice and the guinea pigs necessary for doing all of the medical research in that site. So those animals were scattered all around North Philadelphia. And eventually, within 25 years or so, they needed to move. To your right, you'll see Kling's first office. He moves right across the street from the Lankenau Institute for Medical Research to study the program, to basically live with the researchers and understand, using the knowledge that he acquired at Sloan Kettering and with SOM hospitals, using it to formulate the plan for Fox Chase. I'll also say that part of the dream was for the Institute for Cancer Research was to get more space, to move to the suburbs, or what were then the suburbs in Northeast Philadelphia, and also to get out of North Philadelphia, right? If you read the documentation, the archival documents for the move, they're already beginning to sense that the neighborhood is in decline, and they'll have difficulty recruiting all of the researchers that they hope to bring to the facility. Okay, so Kling, importantly, okay, I see David Brownlee say that the back house to Kling's office was indeed a stable. That is true. So he expands little by little as the firm grows until he moves to the big Kling and Associates office, but it was indeed a stable. Okay, so he doesn't do the Institute for Cancer Research by himself. He recruits a man, a really forgotten figure in his story, named Harry Arons, who was one of those old school hospital architects. He's a generation older than Kling, and he's his right-hand man. He's his first employee. Arons was the lead designer for many of SOM's hospital projects, including a huge project, the Ohio State Medical Center, which you see here to the right. This building is a SOM hospital through and through, and we'll see it in many ways in Lankenau once we get there. So keep it in mind. You see again the same formula, the ribbon windows with the solar barriers above them, grade changes separating the inpatients from the outpatients, and the large nursing stack, all in this modular system. So here's the Institute for Cancer Research. The key words for this project, and really for all suburban laboratory sites in this era, are flexibility and expansibility, right? Each lab needs to be able to be reconfigured in any number of ways, and Kling and Arons do that by basically designing the whole facility around a 9-foot module, which you can see in the plan. I found this plan as a brochure in the archives of Swarthmore College. That 9-foot module is really made up of a 4-foot wide workbench and a 5-foot wide aisle, right? So when you can double that to an 18-foot laboratory, you can keep a 9-foot laboratory, you can do any variation of 9 feet, really. And you see that here in a standard, this is 18 feet. Here you have 18 feet, sorry, this is the 18 feet plus 9. Here's another 9. Here's a shorter utility room. But the basic idea is you keep the module all on one side of the building, and then on the other side where you have offices, you have open windows and the best view basically of the house, which they thought would be very appealing for researchers. All of that flexible space is served by an interior here, service stack that goes through the entire length of the building, which the laboratories can connect into through a conduit, which basically runs through the entire length of the facility. It's, in theory, infinitely expandable, and that's what was so important about the suburban site. They really believed in the growth of medical knowledge, so they didn't want to constrain the site. It could be, you could add on bays of laboratory space as the Institute grew. The other important part of the site is the animal colony here. You can see it right in the corner of this photograph. It's connected with a glazed air trap bridge. And why is this so important? Because these mice and rats and guinea pigs, that's the biomedical data, right? They're inbred generation after generation. If that data goes, a lot of this research goes. So they were very concerned in the event of a power outage or something like this, that the humidity and air conditioned animal colony needed to remain protected. And that's why you see in the corner here that there's greater use of the heavy masonry in the animal colony, because they thought that the thermal mass would retain more of the heat. So this is the base. It's really 3 parts, and you don't see it in the plan. There's also a greenhouse, but it's flexible laboratory space, an animal colony, and a greenhouse. That's the Institute for Cancer Research. These are just spreads from the Inquirer and the Evening Bulletin, really trying to just show the immense curiosity and excitement surrounding the age of big science, right? They were equating these scientists with war heroes almost, right? So there was the war on cancer, and always in these spreads, The institute itself, Kling's design, it's almost a character alongside the scientists hovering over their beakers and new amazingly powerful Siemens electron microscopes. So the building itself is associated with the new age of technology. Okay, so we'll go to a Hill Burton. If you remember back to what I was describing with Marshall Schaffer, this is one of those Hill Burton community hospitals, Hunterdon County Community Hospital, completed in 1952. Kling gets the commission as he's completing the Institute for Cancer Research. Hunterdon is basically a third the size of what Lankenau would be, but it's Lankenau in miniature. Remember the basic H plan, right? So I'm pointing, I'm realizing I need to use my mouse here. The H plan is one large nursing stack with the stem. In that stem, you get all of the X-ray machinery, a lot of the diagnostic rooms, and on the little H, the little side, is the most public side of the hospital, where you have outpatients coming in for daily checkups. Oftentimes there's rentable doctor space there. That's really the most public side of the building. The nursing stack is the most private side. Also including, you can see here, cantilevering out is a surgical suite. And importantly, you see the amazing landscape approach, right? So this is the automobile age. We are no longer in an urban confines with a kind of monumental portico to a hospital. In the modern post-war hospital, you always approach with your car. And one of the paths leads around to the emergency room. The other path sweeps to a grand, porch entrance, which you can enter either into the clinics, the outpatient side of the building, or if you're going in for surgery, the inpatients. Here's a plan. Hopefully, I know it's small font, but you can see at least a little bit the outline. Again, it's a modular design in the nursing side, following the SOM formula. It's a single loaded corridor. On one side, you'll see the bedrooms, sometimes double bedrooms. On the other side, you get storage and utility and nurses' stations. The STEM, radiography, you get the film unit, all of the therapy rooms. You get all of those parts of the facility that will be shared by the inpatients and the outpatients. And then on the other side of the building, as I explained, you get exam rooms. Also, if you turn to the first floor, this is the second floor, you'll see an auditorium, and that's a new part of the post-war hospital. It's a community hospital insofar as it brings all of the community into the building, not just the sick. So you get this emerging sense of public health, of preventative health, and the hospital as inching ever more central into toward the center of the life of the community. It's not pushed to the edge, as you might have seen with a 19th century hospital because of fears of illness. It's now being associated with health and preventative health. And so the community might go to the auditorium, for example, to hear local election debates, or new parents might come to learn about childcare. It's really becoming a community center. Okay, so this leads us right up to Lankenau, the breakthrough. In Lankenau, I'm going to describe the social context and the design of the project. I'll also describe some of the ways that Kling civilizes the machine. That's a phrase that I borrow from an American studies scholar named Jonathan Casson. Really a way to assimilate new technologies so that all of these amazing atomic age technologies, they don't appear on the main line as an alien force, but they're assimilated into the community in a variety of ways. And then lastly, I'll talk about the fundraising that was necessary for a voluntary hospital like Lankenau Hospital. Lankenau Hospital was unlike Hunterdon in that it was not publicly funded. It didn't receive that Hill-Burton funding. It was privately funded, and it was for really an elite community, a wealthy community. And there was a major fundraising campaign that was put together by the Lankenau Building Committee and Board of Trustees to engage a broad public, which would be the clientele for the hospital, and to, as they say, as fundraising people and philanthropy people say, to go big game hunting or whale hunting to get those really big donors that would fund the facility. Okay. First, though, I want us to clear from our mind whatever recent memories we have of Lankenau, because the campus has been so covered in parking, the original design is almost impossible to see. And that, in a way, speaks to Kling's short-sightedness. He didn't provide nearly enough parking for the facility as it would expand. And I also want us to rethink this site from the perspective of Kling in the 1940s and the early 1950s, because at the time it was designed and constructed, Philadelphia was really thought of as potentially becoming that technological center in the nation. So I love this quote from a historian, Margaret Pugh O'Mara, who wrote a book called Cities of Knowledge, which describes this moment in the history of Philadelphia. She writes, in 1940, if a casual observer had been asked which large American metropolis, the San Francisco Bay Area or Greater Philadelphia, would become the capital of the nation's high-tech industry 60 years later, they would have very likely answered Philadelphia. Philadelphia was then the third largest city in the country. And I'll add that this area of suburban Philadelphia was the second fastest growing metro area in the country. And its region was headquarters to many leading electronic and advanced scientific firms. Because the US financial sector was concentrated almost entirely on the Eastern Seaboard, Philadelphia firms and entrepreneurs had easy access to the necessary private financing. Of course, there was the University of Pennsylvania, the region's most prestigious research institution, which was home to one of the nation's finest engineering schools and to the nation's first supercomputer. So the idea was that Lankenau would be part of this emergence of Greater Philadelphia as a leading region, technological region. So there's also other social contexts that I want to briefly mention. One was the decline of North Philadelphia. So the old German Hospital of Philadelphia, located right across the street from Girard College, as I mentioned, this area was changing, and the hospital needed to move, it needed to expand, and it was no longer a German community, really. That community had left, and the racial and socioeconomic demographics of the area were changing. So that too was an important part of the context. So there was a push. I think of this as there was a push factor, how North Philadelphia was changing at the moment, and there was a pull factor, which was the main line as this home to a new kind of technological suburbs. I also mentioned that briefly that the main line was was changing just in the immediate area. So if you know Shortridge, which was a subdivision of a larger estate immediately adjacent to or close by Lankenau Hospital, that was just being subdivided in 1945. The Wynwood Shopping Center went in 1954. So that immediate area where Lankenau would be inserted into the landscape, that was changing and it was really being built up. That would be the clientele that was pulling the German hospital, Lankenau Hospital, out to the suburbs. I like these images because they show a 19th century hospital as symbolizing really the ethnic identity of a community. To the right, you see what's essentially a Italian Renaissance portico, right? This is the hospital as mansion, and like as was the Mary J. Drexel home. Mary J. Drexel of the Drexel family donates this entire facility. Amazing kind of Gothic facility for the deaconesses that would administer, the Lutheran deaconesses that were brought to the German hospital from Germany. It was also an old folks home, a girls' school, a chapel. So this was really the hospital as a monument to an ethnic identity that was no longer really in existence in that community. Okay, I want to briefly say that I never try to underestimate Victorian technology because it always surprises me. And there was the German hospital was sited in a really remarkable way, right? So before the hospital was sealed up into a environmentally controlled, artificially, climatically controlled facility, it depended on the surrounding landscape. And this area, a fair amount of, was really one of the highest areas of the city, the coolest. And when I looked at the Atlas image from 1895, the hospital was sited immediately across the street from the Corinthian Avenue Basin, which the hospital staff assured patients would further kind of air condition the site. And this is the interior courtyard, making it much cooler and healthier than the lower areas of the city. So there was a sense of, there was a Victorian sense of science here. It was based on a miasma theory of disease. It wasn't the bacterial theory of modern medicine, which really was not dependent on convalescing in a beautifully landscaped interior environment. It was, the hospital really was sealed in after this moment. Okay, but I like, it was also about environmental control. So when Lankenau appeared in progressive architecture in 1954, it appeared in an issue devoted to environmental control, right? And alongside other kinds of buildings that depended on AC units and the use of modules like Japanese tatami mats to control the interior. It also was thought to embody a sense of professional excellence. And that's what this quote above is trying to describe, that it wasn't necessarily original, it wasn't novel as much as it was the consummation of the profession's investment in developing the hospital type. So it was excellent, if not original. Okay, so this is the original proposal that Kling submitted for the whole Lankenau campus plan. You will see here the sand pits of the sand pits of the old Overbrook Golf Club. So that is the site that the Lankenau Hospital Building Committee purchased for the move. It was this pastoral setting, and it provided lots of space for expansion and a full campus that was linked together here. A main hospital, you can see the H-plan hospital. Here's the STEM. Here's the doctor's offices. Not all of it, this wasn't how it finally was built out, but this was the original design. There would be nurses' residence on site. There would be a research building as well. It was all this integrated site. Here's an alternate plan that I thank Greg Pritchard from Lower Merion Township for sharing with me. I like this image because you can see City Line Avenue, you can see Friends Central School here, you can see the old Sacred Heart Academy on the upper left, which is now the JCC. You can see also the withdrawal of certain old mainline institutions like the Overbrook Golf Club, which is now in Villanova, and Sacred Heart, which is now in Bryn Mawr. You can see those kind of WASP institutions withdrawing from City Line Avenue, moving westward as a new group of mainliners cross City Line to diversify the area and live in many of the subdivisions that are being built out. So I appreciate this image more for the site, the description of the site necessarily. In the plan, you can also see this is a T. Here's the main hospital building that Savory, Sheets, and Gilmore proposed. It's a T as opposed to an H-plan hospital. Okay, this is the ground floor of Lankenau. And by now you can see in the elevation, as well as the plan, a kind of palimpsest that I've been building up from Sloan Kettering to the Institute for Cancer Research in Hunterton. Kling is using everything that he's picked up in Lankenau. You see, again, the division of the nursing stack from the outpatients with a STEM, and again, the auditorium that he built in Hunterton, but at a much larger scale. This is now a hospital fit for 350 as opposed to 150. It's roughly, 3 times the size. You can also see the grade division between where the ambulance enters and where the outpatients enter, and where the main entryway is. I don't know if many of you have entered this facility, but you drive up and the first thing you hit a health museum. That is a new feature of the hospital, which is right above the auditorium. The thought was, when you'd come in to visit a patient who had just had surgery and is in one of the nursing rooms, you'd pass by the health museum and learn something on the way about nutrition or the latest research in biomedical science or in health nutrition, public health nutrition. Okay, there's also a very generous, this is again the ground floor dining room facing south, and also an upper dining room area. Those, you can see here the regular bay, right? That regular 24-foot bay, 2-room bay on the upper stories. This is now the 4th floor where the nursing stack really begins. Bays, in each bay, 2 rooms with a private bathroom, which was thought to be really luxurious when Lankenau opened in 1954. Hunterton, the patients in Hunterton had to share a bathroom with their neighbor, but at Lankenau you had your private bathroom, and you had all of the nursing stations and utility closets and such on the north side. So the best view, again, that's the primary element of the design, facing southwards towards Center City. Okay, so Lankenau went up fairly quickly, not totally without any problems. The steel girders collapsed under high wind, but they put it up as soon as they could, and it was done around 18 months later. Here are some images just emphasizing Lankenau's technological modernity, right? Everyone who entered this facility, they knew they were entering the modern hospital. And Lawrence S. Williams, Larry Williams, probably one of the foremost photographers in the post-war period in Philadelphia, photographed most of Kling's major projects. He clearly picked up on that technological modernity. Of course, when he photographed one of the double nursing rooms, he caught St. Charles Borromeo and a Baroque Italian Renaissance seminary from across what Lancaster Avenue, just as this kind of echo of a much older period of architectural history. So through juxtaposition, he was emphasizing the modernity of the space. It was also the modernity was emphasized with constant reference to the old facilities, to the old German hospital. So just so that memory of the 19th century hospital was there for everyone who read the mainline Times. I want to emphasize some of the instrumentation, the new instrumentation that went into the facility. I've circled probably the most popular instrument, known as the cobalt bomb, which was in the basement of Lankenau, and I think it was for radiation treatment for lung cancer when it was difficult to isolate with conventional radiation instrumentation the interior of the body. So the patient would lie on this bed, and the cobalt bomb, which got everyone's attention, would rotate around it on both axes. You can also see the incredible you can see x-rays. I'm blanking here. So someone help me. Every time I go to the bank, or old banks, I see
pneumatic tubes.
These great pneumatic tubes. Thank you, whoever helped me with that. Maybe that was my dad. The incredible pneumatic tube system that went throughout the ducts of Lankenau, connecting to the nursing stations. You can also see things like whirlpools and stainless steel sinks, which were new. And this is just showing that the international community was keeping close tabs. This is Lankenau, a feature on Lankenau that appeared in the Japanese press. Okay, so Lankenau was also a showpiece. Every supplier who took part in the project reproduced Lankenau in the pages of the architectural press. So it really was not just having this outsized impact on the local community who would use it. The whole national architectural press knew of Lankenau. The landscape for Lankenau was done by Thomas W. Sears, who was an Olmsted Brothers disciple. I think at the same time, he was redesigning a portion of Washington Square. But I love this image, which Jerry Francis of the Lower Merion Historical Society shared with me, because you see that amazing picturesque sweep up into the main entry of Lankenau. The landscape here was almost I'm saying it's trying to civilize the machine, because it's trying to bring the building into a very rich, a landscape with a very rich tradition, obviously, a rich landscape tradition, while still giving it space for expansion. And it's almost a monumental approach, although not symmetrical. Another way to civilize the machine was texturally, through the use of brick. I thank Diana from the Lankenau archives for bringing out such amazing material for me, including things like the Lankenau red brick. I guess Kling had branded his own shade of brick. So it's a much longer brick, not quite Wrightian length, but a longer brick, that the warm color and the texture was thought to soften the building, and it's been used in Lankenau's new facilities. Here are some more Larry Williams photographs, which I can't comment on, but it just goes, they help describe the really luxuriousness of the interior. It wasn't antiseptic in feeling, although it was, of course, antiseptic for medical purposes, but it almost appears, there's a glamour to Lankenau, which I think the Larry Williams images capture. I'll just go through them slowly here. Here are the nursing stations. Here's the chapel and a modular glass wall system. I believe this is right below the outpatient clinics on the ground floor. You can see, the just love of that, the architectural photographer's love of that crisp corner, which of course we'll see later in images by Julius Schulman. Okay, so here's a nice image. When I saw this Larry Williams photograph, I immediately thought of a German hospital photograph that I had seen from 1895. Here's the transformation of the Victorian hospital to the post-war hospital in brief, right? You have wood floors on one side with these wood molded windows. Here you have open, almost floor to ceiling windows, an electric heater as opposed to the oil heater. You have this upholstered lounge, which you would never have because of liquid control, you might say. And you have the classic, steel bed. Here is the modern bed, triple hinged modern bed, which is a bed and lounge in one, which immobilizes the patient so that the nurse can push the patient all around the hospital and have total control over the patient. And I mean, you also see the electric lighting throughout, as opposed to the gas lighting. Also the oriental carpet, I love that, over the wood flooring and tiling on to the right. Here is the dining room. I'll say I can relay this message from my parents. Lankenau was really the luxury hotel of hospitals. Every new parents on the last night of their stay were treated to a surf and turf dinner. And I can assure you that they kept up with that tradition at least until 1986, when I was born. Okay, so fundraising, the last section of the presentation. There's a long history, of course, to health in the suburbs. I'll go through this slide quickly because I see the time. It wasn't as though health was something new in the suburbs. This is Frank Furness's original Bryn Mawr Hospital, below it, the Chestnut Hill Hospital. And even later in the 1920s, this is the Times Medical Building of 1931 in Suburban Square. Those were doctors' offices. These were medical facilities that were really about convenience during, for example, the summer months or when you couldn't get into the city for serious medical treatment. Around 1950, the hospital, something really changes, and the hospital in the popular and architectural press becomes central. I love this image to the right here. This is by Joseph Neufeld, who taught a really innovative hospital design seminar at Yale between the architecture school and the School of Public Health that imagines the hospital at the very center of the suburban community, almost keeping that community together, right? At a moment like today, this image resonates for me because we're in a moment when the hospital really has become the center of many of our communities. Okay, it was not another Mutter museum. There were medical museums for the purposes of medical education, but Lankenau was the first hospital health museum. It was the first time that a hospital would try to reach out to the community and bring them in really for education and re-education, consistent re-education, so that people wouldn't need to go to the hospital. This was a positive approach to health as opposed to in the paper, what they thought of as a negative approach, as opposed to fixing the broken body, getting ahead of it, right? So they brought everyone in that they could. Here are the local Boy Scout troop members peering into the maw of a face to look, maybe, I guess, look and learn about the esophagus and maybe dental health. To the far right, you see Pandora, the translucent woman, which was also a talking woman, which visitors to the health museum would be greeted by and they learned about the skeletal system and vascular system. I think Lankenau still has Pandora. It may still be on display. I'll also refer back to the plan. The health museum was front and center. It was right by the main entrance. It was given pride of place in Kling's design. And it wasn't, just the rhetoric of community and community health. There was at least an attempt to practice community at Lankenau. These are images that I found in the archive of the family Christmas party at Lankenau, where the nurses were singing the Christmas chorales, and the buffet for everyone, the staff and the medical researchers and the surgeons at Lankenau. What's interesting is that many of these people were immigrants. They were new to America, and Lankenau was really bringing them into the community. They were highly educated Cold War refugees who were doing medical research in a new environment, and they were brought into the community through these kinds of practices of community. I love this image. These are the surgeons in, I guess, doing like the can cross-dressing with their tutus. Lankenau was a voluntary hospital. That means they had to fundraise. They had to raise a lot of money, and it wasn't the trustees that were doing it. By this time, in other words, it wasn't women like Mary Drexel or people like John D. Drexel, who funded the original German hospital. This was professional philanthropy and public relations. So the building committee brought in Ketchum Inc. They used Adelphia Associates. They hired graphic designers to publicize the project and to raise money. One of the ways that they appealed to the masses, like the Better Philadelphia exhibit of 1944, there was a Lankenau exhibit on the Hospital of Tomorrow in 1950 at Gimbel's department store. So they really tried to glamorize Lankenau to a broad public that would choose to go there for the latest the latest procedures. Another way they glamorized it, I didn't know who Esther Williams was before I did this research, but the public relations firm brought in the bathing beauty, this Hollywood star. You know, this was very not mainline, but they brought her in for the groundbreaking to shovel dirt, and they had President Eisenhower send a telegram congratulating the Lankenau board for what was really a groundbreaking of national importance. One of the most bizarre and interesting booklets that I found in the Lankenau archives and this is a connection to Al's lecture from 2 weeks ago, because it was designed by a member of the Panepinto family, Arturo Panepinto. They appealed to big donors with these kind of, in this case, a kind of surrealistic image of what Lankenau could be. It was called A Bold Venture for Health, the New Lankenau. I'll just share some images to show you the kind of surprising imagery that they used. It almost looks like late 80s, early 90s graphic design. In that sense, I think it's ahead of its time. In the booklet, Kling was right at the center. He was cast into the role as the visionary. There are all these kind of esoteric images throughout, icons throughout the booklet. Kling here is the puppeteer, you know, bringing the community into the future. Here's Kling and his staff, a stage photo of Kling huddling over the blueprints. Kling at the center of the dedication ceremonies. Another way that they fundraised was they had a living memorials campaign. This term, living memorials, was an old term. It really arose after World War I with and into the New Deal. It reemerged after World War II. The idea was that memorials should be useful. They shouldn't just be formal objects that people congregated around once a year. They should be useful to the community. And so living memorials would, you know, help build the new facility. What's interesting is that the architecture here is subdivided. Every space is subdivided and monetized so that they can offer what is now called recognition opportunities for each space. So here you can see that the auditorium is going for $150,000, and even a lab, a simple lab, might be going for $2,000. I circled here Moses Annenberg. So Walter Annenberg contributed money for the clinic lobby. It's notable just because not too long before this, Moses Annenberg was notable for the largest federal indictment for tax evasion. So there was a bit of reputation recovery going on here, I suppose. Lastly, I want to say that all of this fundraising was necessary because Lankenau was not publicly funded. And people like J. Howard Pugh, and this is another connection to Al's lecture from 2 weeks ago, they gave big checks because they saw institutions like Lankenau, like the Institute for Cancer Research, like Thomas Jefferson University, which Kling also did, as really bulwarks against what Pugh called the governmental mind. And they were ways to fight socialized medicine. Not everyone believed this. This is not all that Lankenau symbolized, but it's part of the context of Cold War conservatism that was informing these projects. Lankenau was the never-ending project. It would expand decades beyond 1954. Kling was involved in things like the design of a theater of life, as well as something as small as a snack bar, which was put in 1969. And not just Kling and Associates, Kling himself remained involved in the project. I'm going to end on this slide, which one of my father's colleagues at Jacob shared with me. This is from an old Kling and Associates booklet. Many medical and welfare buildings followed Lankenau, which you see reproduced here on the left. This is, of course, the nursing staff. Meant a lot of money. Many projects followed Lankenau. But Kling insisted he was not just a hospital architect. He was a corporate architect, and that these facilities were part of a diversified portfolio, and that they helped him and his firm improve the design of other projects like high rises and corporate campuses and academic architecture. So really what I'm trying to say here is that if we stay with the perspective of Kling, Lankenau leads on to more projects, different kinds of projects like Penn Center, which is perhaps his best known, which would follow. Okay, thank you very much. I want to especially thank Diana Briggs from the Lankenau Hospital Archives and all of the other archivists and curators who helped me put together this material. Thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you very much. This was a very stimulating and thoroughly researched and well organized presentation on a subject that is of great interest to many people in the region, and your enthusiasm came across quite well. And thank you for, let's leave this image up for a while so people could contact you or see what you're doing in your newsletter. I think that's terrific. I have noticed that, yes, we give you virtual applause from afar. I'm trying to see if I can find some questions. I see there is a comment, and unfortunately we've lost a little bit of the chronology here, but there's a question about a connection to Alvar Aalto, for example, and
Right.
Kling's being influenced by him. Is there something you would like to say about that?
Yeah. So the hospital, this really speaks to how an earlier generation of modernists informed the post-war corporate generation. Alvar Aalto's sanatoria is probably the most famous healthcare facility of heroic modernism. There weren't many healthcare facilities of the 20s and 30s that people like Kling studied when they were exposed to modernism, but it was certainly a reference point. And for SOM and for that SOM formula, that emphasis on the view, the nursing, the view from the nursing room as the primary orienting element of the whole site, that there's a connection there to Aalto.
Terrific. I see that Lee Altmeyer also asked a very particular question. At the time when you were talking about the precedents, the earlier hospitals at the beginning, were they designed with generators, water, and other self-sustaining emergency provisions?
They were, well, okay, so the Institute for Cancer Research did not have a backup system, which is why they were so concerned with making the animal colony with heavy masonry so that it could retain some of the thermal mass and the temperature wouldn't drop and the mice would get sick and die, which would be a catastrophe for the researchers. But in Lower Merion Township, for example, there I found, and Greg Pritchard shared with me this material, they definitely had backup generators, and it was actually close to Lankenau and some of the neighboring properties. And you can imagine there was lots of pushback because nobody wanted the generator in their back lawn, that nobody wanted to see. They didn't want to see the generator. They were happy to see Lankenau as the city on a hill from far away, but they didn't want to hear it.
Great. Well, while we're talking about architectonic issues, and I will give people, particularly Steve Peitzman is asking if he could ask a question live. Before we get to those, there's Bill Lewis is asking about what were the motivations behind the thin, long bricks? Was there a particular functional purpose to those beyond any aesthetic value?
Yeah, if you can see, I'm going to go, I think the best image, sorry, let me find it. Okay, so you can see here, you see those thin, long bricks, which crucially, they're stacked in line, right? So if you know, for example, Lou Kahn and Bill Whitaker's great book on Lou Kahn's domestic architecture, there's a great image of the shadow joint where he really pushes the mortar of the masonry work into the building so you can really see each masonry unit as its own object, right? With Kling in Lankenau, these bricks are stacked in line so that if you needed to make additions to any space, you wouldn't have the nasty mortar joint to kind of patch up. You could just add more rows, right? So that speaks to the extreme emphasis on flexibility and expansibility, and also bringing, this is a classic modernist trope, bringing the interior inside. So that brick is on the exterior of the building, facing the steel and concrete structure, and it's also on the interior of the building to, in a sense, warm it up. And I guess the length of it is perhaps a reference to the horizontality that's associated maybe with American modernism in a figure like Wright.
Steve, would you be interested in asking your question at this point?
Yeah, I sure would. It was a wonderful presentation. I've been interested in hospital architecture at an earlier period for a couple of years now. And just two quick comments and then an actual question. One is, I'm not sure I would agree with your portrayal of the urban neighborhood hospital as not welcoming the neighborhood. In fact, one could make an argument just the other way around, that they were well supported even with small donations. It was a place where an individual could walk to the outpatient clinic, to walk to visit a family member in the hospital, maybe near a workplace where injuries could occur. And in many ways, they were cherished as a neighborhood place like churches, at least in my opinion. I think the contrast you showed of the two private hospital rooms was really wonderful. The one from 1890s, I guess, and the Lankenau. And yet they both represent the same phenomenon, which was in the period of 19th century charity hospitals, the need to lure in paying patients and to make and both really represent the idea to make the patient forget that they're in a hospital, or maybe to the right, forget that they're in a hotel room. But even though you pointed out many of the particular differences, the intent is pretty much the same. Now, in terms of the Institute for Cancer Research, you mentioned the idea of...
Steve, can I just respond to those before?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I think maybe I misspoke, because I guess what I was trying to emphasize was that the hospitals were serving a monumental function to symbolize, in the case of the German hospital, the German community in North Philadelphia and the surrounding area, that at the time of the move in the early 50s, it really no longer existed. In the archives, there are great examples on Thanksgiving Day. It was a tradition, for example, for the elite of that German community to walk over and give a check to the German hospital. And it was, you're absolutely right, it was well supported by the community and invited the community in. The image to the right here in 1895, that represents probably the very best room that a paying patient would be treated to. It wasn't one of the wards which an indigent patient would have stayed in. Okay, so that would just be my response, but please go ahead with your question.
No, of course, you're right. That community sense eventually vanished with so many of the hospitals. In fact, most of those hospitals have vanished. So anyway, with the Cancer Research Institute, you pointed out that flexibility was needed for science. But I wonder how much designers, architects, or engineers working with them could do that with the hospital. In other words, when Lankenau was built, maybe you didn't know yet that you would need space for a coronary care unit or cath labs or a dialysis unit. And how was that? Was that an awareness? How was that confronted?
Okay. Oh yeah. So flexibility is one of these great post-war keywords in architectural discourse. And actually, a British scholar named Adrian Forty, he has a great book on these keywords. And he says that the thing that's always stuck with me is that the trick of flexibility is a way for the architect to project control over an environment that will change into the future. So that when you design a flexible space, you're designing 20 years, 30 years into the future, or at least ideally. Of course, sometimes there are issues and these flexible spaces don't prove so flexible. But right, okay, but you're right that they couldn't always anticipate new medical technologies or the needs of the hospital, and that's why so many of these supposedly flexible modernist post-war hospitals, there's really dramatic interventions made into them, and they almost become unrecognizable.
Kevin, can I jump in?
Please.
Fletcher McNeil here. I'm a healthcare architect. 37 or 8 years of experience specializing in healthcare architecture. Before I got into that, I was a carpenter, and I worked on Frank Lloyd Wright houses, and I developed an incredible reverence for the modernist architects, and I have a great reverence for Vincent Kling. But unfortunately, this is all very romantic. His modules, the floor plates don't serve us well now, and we have to figure out what to do with these buildings. I happen to be working for Temple University Health now as an architect planner, and I'm doing a lot of work at Fox Chase. I've done a lot of work there over the last 20 years. The Institute for Cancer Research, which is now called the Ryman Building, no longer serves the function of the modern laboratory. And Lankenau Hospital, the original armature of the hospital, no longer serves today's healthcare requirements. And those have been changed by Americans with Disabilities Act, by federal regulations, by medical technology, and they no longer serve the functions, the purposes that they were intended for originally. So I'm not trying to be a naysayer. What I'm trying to say is we need to find a way to revere this great architecture and preserve it somehow, and maybe borrow from it as we design new buildings and make reference to it. But it won't work. One of the biggest problems, and you didn't mention this, but I'm telling you, is floor-to-floor heights. We can't get modern HVAC systems into the 11-foot 6, 12-foot floor-to-floor heights of those buildings that Vincent Kling designed. And, you know, he was a great architect, just like Frank Lloyd Wright. I know Wright's buildings as a carpenter. I know them from the inside out. And he was an egomaniac. You know, if there was a problem with the building, he blamed it on the owner. You know, if the roof leaked, he blamed it on the owner, not on the architect. So, you know, we have to recognize all this. And Vincent Kling was something of an egomaniac too.
For sure.
You know, so, but, you know, he did great stuff. He was an important architect in the Philadelphia area. And Philadelphia, if you go way back, you know, even Louis Sullivan got his start in Philadelphia, believe it or not. So, you know, we have to celebrate our heritage, but we have to bring it up to the modern era.
Yeah, well, I think that Kevin is not advocating for modern hospitals to be designed like this one, but for us to see it as an example of how
I totally
hospital
agree.
design has moved on. Yes.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just
Right.
saying what we need to do. The next step is, what do we do with this heritage? What do we do with it? How do we
Right.
celebrate it in an appropriate way to bring it up to the modern day?
Right. Thanks, Fletcher. I completely agree that we have to make that determination first. To make those to make that determination of what we'll do with these spaces, we have to try to understand them and see, you know, it sounds like, you know, you have an intimate knowledge of what works, what doesn't. The hospital as a technological space, as you're suggesting, it goes obsolete very quickly because technology changes. However, I will say that as a community space, right? I think what's kind of remarkable about Lankenau is it's in the intense investment in a community spirit for a short period of time. And it was probably caused by anxiety about what will this community look like? It's no longer that classic main line. What will it look like going forward?
Yeah.
And the hospital symbolized the community, and I think hospitals still symbolize communities. Thank you, though.
Actually, here's an interesting point that Bruce Laverty brings up. He has seen writings by Kling regarding the role of the landscaping and possibly as a way of remediating against radiation. Do you know anything about, have you seen anything about that?
Oh, yes. Okay, so that is absolutely true. So for example, that cobalt bomb is the deepest point of Lankenau underground. And it was part of the idea of landscaping the hill the way it does. And I haven't seen images, good topographic images of Overbrook Golf Club, so I don't really know the lay of the land, so to speak. I'm pretty sure they created much of that hill, and much of it was because they were expecting to do a lot of radiation.
Understandably so. In a completely different direction, Grace Anyang asks a question that you might be able to answer, given that you talked about SOM as well as Kling. And she says, to relate Kling's work to the idea of corporate practice, how did his corporately organized architecture firm compare to SOM's, and also to the possibly corporately organized hospital system?
I can't speak to the latter. I don't really know about the corporate organization of the hospital system, but as to SOM, it was a direct mirror. Kling tried his best, and I know tried his best to replicate the SOM model of working with separate design teams. So that is considered a form of corporate hierarchy that is, I guess it's called, you know, it's like the multi-divisional corporate firm. In any case, it's project-based. So I learned this from speaking on the phone with some of the old Kling employees, and they said that in terms of the actual work process and the organization of the firm, he and Fritz Huber and a lot of the other associates They followed the SOM formula, not just in the design of the hospitals, but also in the design of their own firm.
Interesting. I'd like to combine the next two questions since we are getting kind of late here, but they have to do with a really interesting issue of local character. And so part of Dan's question is, are there characteristics that might speak to the presence of a Philadelphia school? David Brownlee kind of piggybacks on that, asking about, why no Philadelphia stone in the tradition of Howe and Kahn, and the idea of a regional vernacular, if you want to call it that.
Okay, so I've brought us back to the Institute for Cancer Research because you can see in the circulation stacks, the stair stacks here, the piers basically separating the modular units, as well as in the animal colony. His first impulse was to use Wissahickon stone. And if you look at many of the homes that Dan Vieira has schooled me on, the Kling homes, they certainly use the Wissahickon. And so he's marketing himself. I don't know if this is intentional or if he's just picking up on the regionalist spirit, but he tries when he can, not at Lankenau, but in other projects, to integrate that material palette that's associated with the region. I'll also say, in terms of the connection to the Philadelphia school, part of what I'm trying to emphasize is a theoretical intervention, which is that when we think of the Philadelphia school and we rely on that infamous Jan Rowan article, which named it, we're talking about Kahn and Kahn's disciples, people like Venturi and Mitchell Jurgala, and even and Geddes Brecker, Qualls Cunningham, right? When we talk about the Philadelphia school, we don't talk about Kling, and yet we really should. Why? Because, Brecker and Qualls, for example, before they started Geddes Brecker, Qualls Cunningham, were Kling employees. And they began their career with Kling. And Kling interacted with Kahn constantly. And Kling's marketing director, Weld Cox, who really invented the field of architectural marketing, he's the one who gets Venturi much of his work and develops the formula for being a small scale avant-garde architecture firm. So I think we really, and that's what the King Khan image is trying to convey, that we need to see them together. And that's a greater Philadelphia school that I think will help us reevaluate that moment in this area's architectural history.
Thanks. I can't read these comments, excellent comments, fast enough. Bill Whitaker also embellishes your answer by talking about Philadelphia being on the fault line between the clay deposits of the coastal plain that obviously produce the brick and the distinctive stone, which is sort of on the other side of the fault line in the suburbs. And by using brick, Lankenau is actually connecting back to the city of brick. That's really, Bill, thank you so much. That's an excellent observation that you threw in there.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, I will try to make sure that these comments get saved so that we'll have reference to them, Kevin. It was Bill Lewis writes, it was my honor to invite Mr. Kling back to Lankenau shortly before his death when he signed the brick now in the Archives Museum.
Oh, wow.
That's wonderful, thank you. Bill Whitaker again, the stone characteristic of the Piedmont Plateau, of course, is the Wissahickon schist that so many people in Philadelphia architecture know about, or one of the stones. The Kling brick was developed as an, oh, thank you, this is Fred Block.
I know him.
Yes, I gathered that, right? The Kling brick was developed as an elemental piece of modularity in the nature of the concept of ease of expansion.
I won't
Kevin, jump
disagree.
in here whenever you feel like you need something.
Yeah,
You have to say something.
okay. What I'm taking though from all of the comments is there is interest in that brick. So I'll have to look, I'll have to integrate more analysis on the materials used in these projects. Thank you.
Steve Peitzman, always the doctor, points out how easily clean brick might be compared to stone, which would make sense in a hospital environment. And where is the recording available? Excellent question, Mr. Lowry. Our goal is to post the recording of this lecture and our previous lectures that we've recorded on our website. And it's going to take us a few weeks to get this organized, but it will be there eventually. You will be able to access it then. So just you'll have to sit tight and give us a little time to deal with the logistics. I think it is getting late, but maybe we have time for one last question if anybody would like to speak up.
I'll just emphasize very quickly, if you know anything about Kling, please get in touch with me. And I haven't published any of this work, so I can still add new important information. So I really appreciate all the feedback you'd offer.
Excellent. Kevin, again, on behalf of everyone who attended tonight, I want to thank you for an inspiring talk, which clearly elicited a lot of great comments and questions. We could probably go on for another hour with this, and now that you've provided ways to contact you, people can continue the discussion. Thank you all. Thank you, Dan, for initiating this series and for connecting us with Kevin and this talk. We look forward to seeing you at a future event for the Philadelphia chapter of SAH. Have a safe and good evening, everyone. Bye.